Joining me now is a scholar of African culture and history, and together we'll navigate the multifaceted role fashion has to play in connection, education, storytelling, and reclaiming the African narrative.
Journalist Alexis Okeowo explores her Nigerian cultural background through the lens of fashion in a recently published article for Vogue magazine. The piece offers up a heartfelt ode to her aunties and their inimitable sense of style. Okeowo, who was raised by Nigerian parents in America, recalls the annual Christmas throwdowns of her childhood that brought family and friends out in their finest traditional clothing. A sea of blinding bright textures and elaborate head ties that stretched toward the ceiling. During those holiday parties, as Fela Kuti and King Sunny Ade played from the speakers, she was struck by the stylish women who floated around the hall. Their hair and makeup were exquisitely done, with big curls and updos, red lipstick, and vivid eyeshadow. Their outfits, planned weeks in advance, melded glamour and comfort, with folds of crinkly glittering fabric, and their jewelry, usually gold or coral, was dramatic. Their shoes and purses matched. Their swagger seemed both over the top and effortless. A visual companion to Okeowo's tribute to the style of her aunties is captured by photographer Nadine Ijewere, showing models in bold looks, inspired by these influential female figures. The models are styled in pieces by Nigerian designers, including Duro Olowu, Kenneth Eze, and Lisa Folawiyo. These modern looks are juxtaposed against a selection of photos curated by archivist Daniel Obaweya of the Nigerian Gothic. Their confident, mismatched prints in brilliant shades, mirrored by the stylish Nigerian women of yesteryear. This editorial offers a distinct commentary on culture that plays into the larger role of fashion today.
Fashion is an essential tool for Africans to connect to their culture and history. If you look at a recent article in Vogue by Alexis Okeowo, shot by Nadine Ijewere, where she takes the concept of the African aunties, which most of us are familiar with, having grown up with, the fact that there were women, anyone older than you, who were considered your aunties, even if they were not blood relations. And so growing up as a young Nigerian American in Alabama, Alexis was surrounded by aunties who she felt, poured into her life and who were there to serve as role models, as mentors throughout her life. And so in this piece in Vogue, she explores the fashion for the aunties, basically showing how, it reflected not just the Nigerian and African culture, but it was a way for them to assert their own identity, to assert their independence, but also to convey, carrying a sense of their culture across, going from Nigeria to America and still being able to maintain that sense of cultural identity, and how that fashion helped her develop a sense of identity, but also connects to other young Africans across the continent and across the globe. With the rise of the Afropolitan culture, with the rise of young Africans wanting to travel and connect with other young Africans across the continent, I think that fashion is playing an essential tool in helping them do that, because it helps them relate to concepts that are similar across different cultures, even across South Asian cultures, even in South American cultures. That idea of the older woman in the family who, not necessarily in the family, but in the society, who helps to pour into you. And so Alexis took that, and through that article in Vogue, we were able to see African fashion coming onto the high fashion scene. And I think it's important, because as young Africans, a lot of us didn't necessarily grow up. When we thought about high fashion, we thought about your Gucci's, your Chanel's, and things like that. To be able to look at a high fashion editorial and see, the indigenous fabrics that you grew up with, that you saw your mothers, your aunties, and all the other women that were surrounding you and building that sense of community, to be able to look and see that in high fashion, I think it does something for uplifting our culture, uplifting our sense of self, and uplifting our identity. So I think in that way, that's one way that we've seen where fashion is helping to serve as an essential tool for teaching Africans about their culture.
Another African creative utilizes the versatile lens of fashion, this time to explore the themes of migration and heritage. In a high fashion editorial for the BBC, Nigerian photographer Obinna Obioma reinvents the blue and white, or sometimes red, black and white checkered bags, popularly known in West Africa as Ghana Must Go. In recent times, and with the advent of globalization, migration of people across neighboring borders and far continents has become a more recurring theme. Many people migrate, seeking better economic prospects, job opportunities, education, and marriage. In his fashion film project, Anyinaga, Obioma reflects on how the bags have transcended their courier status and are used as a personified symbol of migration, being used to carry not just belongings, but also culture, heritage, memories, and beliefs. Teaming up with Chioma Obiebu, a Nigerian visual artist and designer, as well as fashion stylist Wuraola Oladapo, they create pieces which Obioma describes as a fusion of both Western and African designs. For this photographer, the idea is to explore the human condition, particularly issues pertaining to identity, culture, African heritage, and history.
I think in recent years, even as we've seen with the rise of Afrobeats, with the rise of African art, we're seeing African art being used as an essential tool to help young Africans both on and off the continent learn a bit more and connect to their history. So for instance, BBC recently featured the Nigerian-British artist Obinna Obioma, and he did this piece called Anyinaga, which means we are going in Igbo language. And basically, he took the Ghana Must Go bags, those bags that most of us, all of us, are pretty much familiar with, having seen them being used in markets, but I think even more commonly in travel. So a lot of us, we have that idea, even if it was us and our families or someone that we know, transporting their stuff from one city to another in Nigeria, traveling from Nigeria to the US or back. When you look at how migration, especially to and from the African continent, has progressed, I think the Ghana Must Go bags played an essential role in that, and they still do today. And even going back in our history, looking back to how the Ghana Must Go bag got their name, when the Nigerian government issued an edict essentially asking millions of undocumented Ghanaians in Nigeria to return to their country, and in a haste, a lot of them grabbed these bags, and that was what they used to transport them. And so that was where the term originally came from. And so in this piece, Obinna transforms the Ghana Must Go bags into these high fashion pieces. And again, it's just that idea that we can see things that are considered essentially African, and we can see how they can translate onto the big screen, onto fashion, onto high street, and being shown off in places like London, New York, and Paris. And in this piece, he makes everything from the gele, the headgears, to different outfits that that would be worn on any runway across the world. So again, going back to this idea of African fashion being an essential tool to help us to connect to our history, I think a lot of young Africans who may have seen those bags and may have recognized them, may not essentially know the history and where they came from. But once we see them, playing out on this global stage, I think it does start to spark interest in a lot of us to understand exactly where this fashion came from, what it means, what it meant then, and what it could mean for us today. So I think in that way, that is how African fashion is still playing an essential role in helping a lot of us young Africans connect to a bit of our history.
Both projects reviewed here are reminiscent of another stunning editorial released last year by Nigerian photographer Oyediran. Diran's editorial showcased the high sense of fashion and style exhibited by Yoruba women in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Disappointed with an internet search for photos of vintage Yoruba fashion, Diran was inspired to create these striking images. This begs the question of representation, of African culture and history across different mediums, for the sake of preservation and education. Okeowo's piece celebrates the stylish African women whose styles are often appropriated without due credit. It highlights the visual vernacular and schools of style Black women grow up with and around, style that is intrinsic and influential and touches every single sector of fashion, but has never existed in the pages of its most rarefied magazines. Obioma's fashion film reflects a history that is rarely represented. For these creatives, fashion presents an opportunity for accurate representation, validation of identity, and steering the African narrative into rightful hands.
Growing up, again, for most of us, when we looked to the big screen, whether it was music, whether it was art, or whether it was fashion, a lot of what we saw was, European or Western culture. But then, even more recently, this idea of our culture, things that were essentially African being appropriated and then sold back to us, in various images. And so I think there's always been this idea that maybe there was something inferior about African culture, including our fashion, and that it needed to essentially cross the oceans, be repackaged, and then sold back to us for it to be palatable or for us to want to consume it. But I think what we've seen recently, especially with the rise of more young Africans, both on and off the continent, being given these platforms, including in high fashion spaces, to be able to take their fashion, to be able to package it in a way that tells their story, in a way that represents the way that they grew up, whether it was on the continent or mixing different cultures, but in a way that is essentially allowing them to tell their stories and is a true representation of who they are, what they went through, and what their African culture and history means to them. I think there's something so essentially powerful and empowering about that, because if I turn on, my TV today and I see on CNN or I see on NTA and I see a young Nigerian who is essentially having this platform and being able to confidently showcase African fashion and show that it can compete on any global stage, I think it gives the rest of us this idea, this sense of self and sense of security that yes, there's nothing wrong with our culture and with our fashion, that yes, we do have important stories to tell, and that yes, we can use the mediums that we already have to be able to tell those stories. And what we're seeing is that fashion is becoming a really important tool, in a series of tools that we have available to us, including our music, our art, our literature, to be able to tell a complete and full narrative about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going.
So here I am, too foreign for home and too foreign for here, never enough for both. Leaving home for home, this foreign land, bringing with me seeds of my heritage, planting them in this soil where my feet will yet again take root.
Fashion plays a key role in society, both functionally and culturally. At an individual level, the ability to express yourself, or at a collective level, the ability to enable connection and belonging.